Te mea tuatahi ka mihi ki tēnei whare, nā hori ngā tai tēnei whare karakia, hoi noi mihi tonu ngā mihi ki aia me tōna iwi whakahiki. Hoki anō kia tātou, tēnā koe Vincent, thank you for joining us. Let's get straight into it. Vincent, what was the purpose and duration of the Tauranga campaign of 1864?
So the Tauranga campaign began in January 1864, and Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron, the commander of British forces in New Zealand, had requested that troops be sent to Tauranga for a couple of reasons. One, this is in the midst of the Waikato War. He's wanting a diversion from that. And secondly, Tauranga is a route where supplies of men and food and even weapons are being sent to Kingitanga forces in the Waikato, so he's attempting to restrict that, and also hoping that some of the men from the Tauranga Moana iwi will return home to Tauranga and deplete the Kingitanga force, because there is substantial support for the Kingitanga amongst Tauranga iwi because of strong whakapapa and other connections with the various Tainui iwi, especially Ngāti Hoa.
So this was a strategic place. Why was it of strategic interest?
Tauranga is of interest for a number of reasons. One, because of the obvious supply of men and other things to the Tainui tribes across the Kaiamai ranges. And so you had not just people from Tauranga going to Waikato, but also toa from further along in Eastern Bay of Plenty and even the East Coast, coming up along the coast and attempting to make their way to Waikato as well. So Cameron is keen to cut that off. But there are other reasons why the Crown is interested in this district as well. And one is that the lands are very fertile. Tauranga has one of the best harbours on the entire east coast of the North Island, and that makes it an attractive proposition as well. And so in June 1863, when the Crown are formulating their plans for the invasion of Waikato, they propose a line of frontier posts or redoubts across the North Island from Raglan or Kawhia all the way across the island to Tauranga. So already Tauranga is essentially being earmarked for future confiscation, because in order to establish a military post there, you'll need to take land for that. And that's something that colonial ministers, Frederick Whittaker especially, takes a keen interest in. And so when Cameron in January 1863 proposes an expedition to Tauranga, this is supported by ministers with alacrity, but they have their own reasons really for supporting that.
You talked about the fertile land, so apart from the military objectives, were settlers coming at things with another agenda? What was their agenda?
Well, I think for settlers, again, it was this is a very fertile district, a potentially very valuable district. Prior to 1864, there hadn't been any land sold essentially, apart from a small area of the Te Papa Peninsula that is sold to the Church Missionary Society in 1838, 1839. And essentially that's held in trust by the Anglican Church for local Māori. Apart from that, the iwi of Tauranga adamantly refused to sell any land. There's a very small population of Pākehā in the district, some French, others British, and they all essentially marry into various hapu, and they're basically expected to comply with the local tikanga in the area. And there's a very minimal Crown presence in the area as well before 1864. So really this is one of those districts beyond the British frontier line, beyond the control of the Crown. And that's something that a number of people are interested in changing, particularly with the invasion of Waikato creates that opportunity for the Crown to arrive in the district in force and impose its authority, impose its will on the district, acquire lands, establish military posts, plant military settlers in the area, and make other lands available for sale to settlers.
How did the Tauranga campaign begin?
So 21st of January 1864, Colonel Carey and 600 troops land in the district, And initially their orders are to remain on the defensive because the Waikato campaign is still underway, and although Cameron wanted an expedition to Tauranga, he wanted troops to occupy the area. He didn't want to start a full-throated military campaign until he had achieved success in the Waikato. And so after the arrival of the troops, local iwi, Ngāti Rangi, Ngāti Ranganui, Ngāti Pukenga, they clearly understand or interpret the arrival of the troops as a threat, and they believe that war is imminent in the district, and they start preparing for that real possibility. Part of that, as Cameron had hoped for, is that large numbers of men from the various Tauranga iwi who are in Waikato supporting the kingitanga rush home to defend their own lands and their whānau. And a series of pā are constructed, and they prepare for battle with the Crown. And through this time, the British remain on the defensive, and these various pā are constructed. Greer, who takes over from Carrier as the local commander of British forces, refuses to engage with them, and so a series of things happen. One of them is that a formal challenge is issued, that the battle will take place on the 1st of April. And still the British refuse to take that bait. The war in Waikato is still underway, and Ōrākau, the Battle of Ōrākau, winds up on the 2nd of April, 1864. After that, Lieutenant General Cameron sees an opportunity to bring the troops to Tauranga and to achieve a decisive victory over the local iwi.
Why did the British not engage with those challenges to fight?
So the British didn't engage with these various challenges because Cameron, first of all, wanted to achieve victory in the Waikato. And once he'd done that, it opened up the opportunity to bring those troops to Tauranga and to do the same thing there. And that's what he was waiting for, and that's why he had issued orders for the troops that were stationed in Tauranga to remain on the defensive in the meanwhile.
So they wouldn't be drawn into fighting if it wasn't on their terms?
They were waiting to fight on their own terms. On the other hand, for local Māori, in a way, if they had assessed that war was inevitable in the district, then it made sense to fight as soon as possible, because surely they also knew that further British troops would come to the district after the Waikato War had ended. So they were wanting to fight while they had the upper hand in terms of relative numbers and the strength of the different forces.
You mentioned the 1st of April as the day for the fight that was sent by to the commanding officer, along with a remarkable letter from Henare Taratoa, the Code of Conduct. What was in that document?
So Henare Taratoa's Code of Conduct set out various rules for fighting, and it's really quite a remarkable document because the very first Geneva Convention is signed months later in August 1864, and a number of the things in that are anticipated really in this Code of Conduct that Māori at Tauranga themselves devise, and that includes that those who surrender will be well treated, they won't be harmed, that non-combatants, women and children, will not be harmed either, and basically respecting those who are not taking part in the act of fighting, that they will be respected and looked after, and the injured will be looked after and so on as well. So it is a remarkable document, and Henare Taratoa had come from a Christian background. He'd spent time at St John's Theological College in Auckland, and also spent time at the Otaki mission station with Octavius Hadfield, the missionary there. He returned home to Tauranga in 1864 when he heard that war was imminent in the district, and the document that he wrote was later found on his body when he was killed at the Battle of Te Ranga in June 1864, along with a quote from the Bible: "If thine enemy hunger, feed him; if he thirst, give him drink."
So is your suggestion that Henare Tarato's document was somehow fed into the Geneva Convention?
No, I don't think there's any direct connection there, but it's just remarkable how the rules that were independently devised by Māori in Tauranga are very similar to those that are later drawn up by the Red Cross and become basically the accepted code of conduct for fighting war. There's no direct relationship between the two documents, but it just demonstrates how really ahead of its time that this code was.
How do you think the code of conduct was received by the British officers?
The British officers didn't really know what to make of the code of conduct. They were just bemused by it, so they didn't formally respond. They basically ignored it.
So Vincent, are you saying that it was basically ignored by the commanding officers, the code of conduct?
Yeah, the British ignored the code of conduct. I mean, obviously they had their own sort of generally accepted standards of conduct during warfare, and a lot of those wouldn't have been dissimilar, but they didn't formally acknowledge or agree to abide by the code of conduct that had been drawn up by Māori at Tauranga.
Do you think it was aspirations on the side of Henare Tarato or expectations, or just a code of conduct for his men?
Well, I mean, clearly by sending the code of conduct to the British, that they were expecting both sides to have a clearly understood and agreed set of rules by which the future war would be fought.
Do you think Henare Tarato was naive to expect the British to abide by the code of conduct?
I don't think they were naive to believe that. I think that, I mean, a lot of the Māori who fought at Pukehinahina were Christian, and the men that they were fighting against were also described themselves as Christian, and a lot of these rules would have drawn inspiration from, you know, the Ten Commandments and other Christian scripture. So there was probably an expectation that the British would understand that and accept that these were good rules to fight by.
How many imperial and colonial troops assembled for the battle of on April 29?
So Cameron himself arrived in the district on the 21st of April with further reinforcements. By the time of the battle, there were nearly 1,700 troops on the Crown side, including some Marines and sailors and others from the 43rd Regiment.
And what about the Māori defenders at Pukehinahina?
In all, there were around 230 Māori, and there was one large pa which was about 80 metres long, and that had around 200 defenders in it. And so they were from the local iwi, Ngaitirangi, Ngati Ranganui, some Ngati Pukenga. Then there was a smaller fortification about 30 metres away that was connected by a covered tunnel. That had about 30 people in it. Many of them were from Ngati Kuhariki, and it was in that smaller fortification was the only woman, Hene Te Karamu, as well.
Yeah, so tell us, what were Māori facing in terms of the artillery?
Well, in the broader sense, you know, Māori are fighting the sort of world's sole superpower at the time, and they have some of the heaviest artillery ever fired in anger in New Zealand, including a 110-pound Armstrong gun, which is a hugely powerful weapon that hadn't been used before in any wars in New Zealand. And so this is incredibly lethal heavy artillery, and there's a range of big guns that the British have with them, which are used to bombard the pa.
Obviously, General Cameron was confident that his artillery and his army would be able to, as Cam says, pulverise the defenders ahead of the assault. Why was he so confident?
Well, I think Cameron felt that he had overwhelming superiority in terms of the technology, the artillery, and all sorts of other things available to him. I mean, not just the heavy artillery, but also, you know, like the British had sort of latest Enfield rifles, and Māori often were using sort of old muskets dating back from the musket wars, sometimes decades old weapons, limited ammunition. They were outnumbered 7-1. And Cameron had sent some of his men around the back of the pa as well. So it wasn't entirely surrounded, but they had troops on both sides of the pa. They had naval support. They had, they assembled a storming party of 300 men, but they had nearly another 1,400 in reserve, if necessary. So really the force they had available to them was an overwhelming one.
And I guess for some of the Māori defenders who weren't, weren't used to the fights, some of them would have just been supporting for that day. That would have been terrifying for them. What are some of the accounts of the Māori defenders?
Well, so first of all, Cameron does a reconnaissance of the pa on the 27th of April, and he's pretty underwhelmed by what he sees. Like, there's limited timber available in the district, and so the palisading and fencing around the pa is pretty flimsy, and it's not something that Cameron feels at all intimidated by. The next day on the 28th, they send men around the back of the pa, so they can launch assaults on both sides. And then from dawn on the 29th, they begin this enormous bombardment against the pa that lasts for something like 10 hours, from through until 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And about 30 minutes before that, he assembles a force of 300 men, half of them from the Navy and the other from the 43rd Regiment as a storming party. He has a backup storming group of another 300 men ready to follow them in. And throughout the day, this horrendous, terrifying bombardment, there's really no response from inside the pa. There's very little noise. And Cameron and a lot of his men probably assumed that, everybody had been killed, considering what they had been confronted with. And it's only when that storming party enters the pa that they learn how wrong they were about that assumption.
Are there any accounts of the Māori defenders during that period of time where they were being bombarded? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, Hori Ngātai years later recalls the battle and talks about how terrifying this was. Quite early on in the bombardment, I think there are 2 men killed. One of them is a priest who's in the middle of karakia, standing up at the time when he is killed. And it's said that there are about 15 of the people inside the pa are killed throughout that day. Although the pa is later found to be incredibly impressive in all kinds of ways, including bunkers that are, there's a series of small bunkers that are designed so that if any one of them is bombed, it's not going to kill everybody, it's only going to affect a smaller group. That's sort of one of the features of it. Another is that the trenches include zigzags, so if a British soldier gets in it, he can't shoot down the trench and kill a large number of people. So there are various features like that speak to the intricate and impressive military engineering behind the pa itself.
Why was the Pukehinahina Ridge selected as the pa location?
So the pa location was, Europeans called it the Gate Pa because it was constructed on a ridge at the end of the Te Papa Peninsula at a place that marked the end of European land and the start of Māori land. So this was the point at which the Te Papa block, the land that had been acquired by the Church Missionary Society in the late 1830s, that ends, and Māori had erected a fence to warn settlers off entering their lands some years earlier, and that's the point at which they erect the pa. And it's a place where it's about 500 yards wide across, surrounded by swampy tidal water, so not easy to get around. And Cameron had managed to get some of his troops behind it, but it wasn't easy. They had to wade through mudflats in order to get some men behind the pa.
I know that you've talked a little bit about the design of the pa, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to just, give it all to us. Can you explain the genius of the design?
Yeah, so the Pukehinahina pa is designed by Pene Taka, who had observed firsthand during the Northern War, Ohaiwai, Ruapekapeka and so on, and he really applied the lessons from those pā from the Northern War in the design of Pukehinahina, and that included, a series of covered trenches and tunnels, small rua or bunkers that people could shelter in, trenches that included zigzags so that if soldiers got in them, they couldn't fire down the line of the trench. And there were a range of features really that spoke to just how sophisticated the design of the pā was. So from a distance, it may have looked unimpressive to camera, but once they saw it closer up, they realised that it was an incredibly well-designed pā.
Artillery has opened a wide breach in the palisades. What happens when the troops enter the pā?
So the storming party of 300 men approach the pā. No resistance really is offered. Nobody fires back. They get inside the pā, and for a moment, they assume that they've taken it. And it's only moments later that this incredible fire rains upon them, and a lot of the men don't know where it's coming from. It's coming from the occupants of the pā, concealed beneath them in these bunkers, who are firing up through the ground onto them. And that causes chaos and confusion amongst the troops. Large numbers retreat, officers are trying to encourage them on, and it's a chaotic and confused situation. And all of this is taking place in the space of 10 minutes. And so the occupants of the pā had refrained from firing on those British troops until they're actually inside the pā itself. And there's debate around whether that was, as James Belch describes it, a brilliantly executed trap, or was it something else? Was it just accidental? But we know from descriptions by Hori Ngātai and others that Rawiri Puhiraki, the overall commander of the defenders, had ordered those there to refrain from firing until he made the call. And they did that. And that happened when the British troops were inside the pā, the last possible moment, at a point when they had actually assumed that they had taken it. And that they, in that way, inflict huge casualties on the British. So of the 300 men, 31 are killed, including 10 officers, which is an incredibly high proportion of officers. Another 80 are injured. So overall, around a third of that force end up as casualties. And, the British Army at this time, they're not supposed to sort of retreat in a chaotic and confused way in the way they did here, even leaving behind gravely wounded and dying men inside the pā. And so this was regarded as a huge embarrassment and a humiliating defeat for them.
And then what happened?
Well, following that, during the evening, there are a number of British officers and men who are gravely wounded. Colonel Booth, one of the senior British officers, is one of them, and the only woman inside the smaller pā, Hene Te Kiri Karamu, hears him calling out for water, and she decides to take water to him. She takes it in an iron tin. She speaks to him in English. She had grown up in the north and was bilingual. Other British men who are also in a similar situation also ask for water, and she takes that to them. And then she leaves the remaining tin of water with Booth.
Talk us through the chaotic retreat.
Yeah, so there's a chaotic and disorderly retreat. The storming party have lost most of their officers. Meanwhile, some of the troops who are stationed around the back enter the pā, and that pushes Māori from there as well. And it's said that in some theories that this was regarded as a huge additional force of Māori had entered the pā as well. So it's a chaotic and confused situation, and the men basically run back down the hill in panic, and it's not an orderly or organised retreat in any way. It's chaotic and confused and desperate.
And how would that have been viewed by their leaders?
Well, afterwards, some accused the men of cowardice. Others blamed the fact that they had essentially a divided force because some were Navy and others the British Army, and so essentially blaming the makeup of the invading force. And really there are a whole range of excuses that are drawn up for this, which basically skirt around the fact that what happened could be attributed to both the brilliant military engineering of the PAR itself, so the design by Pene Tucker, and also the tactics devised and employed by Rawiri Puhiraki to draw the troops into the PAR and fire on them from below at the latest possible moment. So they had entered a trap that was incredibly well planned and executed.
And what for the wounded and dead soldiers?
So later in the evening, there are a number of gravely wounded and dying officers and men scattered around the PAR. That the retreat had been so chaotic that they hadn't even had time to take their injured men back with them, which is again considered a source of acute embarrassment. One of the men is Colonel Booth, one of the senior British officers, and he's lying there dying, and he calls out for water, and Hene Te Karamu, the only woman inside the PAR at the time that the battle breaks out, hears this, and she leaves the PAR and she takes water to him in an iron tin, speaks to him in English. She sees other injured men lying around as well who also ask for water. She takes the water to them. She returns with what's left in the tin to Booth. Following that, during the night, the Māori occupants of the PAR evacuate. They'd achieved their purpose. They'd inflicted a crushing and humiliating defeat on the British. So when the British enter the PAR the next day, they're not quite sure what to expect. Booth is still alive. He talks about how well he'd been treated, and some of the other men do as well. And they discover that the Māori had, honoured the code of conduct that Hinare Taratoa had devised, well and truly, and in many ways had gone above and beyond that in terms of, Hene risking her own life to take water to gravely wounded British officers and men. So the British recognise and acknowledge that incredible chivalry that is shown during the conflict.
And General Cameron, what would he write in his diary?
Cameron afterwards, in his official report, said that he couldn't account for what had happened. He didn't know what to make of it. And lots of others are banding around various theories and explanations and excuses for what took place. Cameron doesn't even engage with that. He obviously there are lots of people calling for revenge for what had happened, for the losses of British men there. Cameron again decides he's going to have nothing to do with this, so he leaves Tauranga a few weeks later on the 16th of May and departs with most of his men and gives instructions to those that remain behind to remain on the defensive as well. So he doesn't respond to those calls for retribution, for revenge for what had taken place.
The bodies, the British feared that bodies would be desecrated and the wounded killed. What unfolded in the hours after the battle?
So the British, when they enter the PAR the next day, they find, men like Booth is still alive, explains how well he'd been treated, that a woman had taken water to him during the night, and others also talk about the the kindness. None of the bodies had been mutilated or anything like that had been feared. And in fact, not only had the occupants of the pā honoured Inare Taratoa's code of conduct, but in many ways they'd gone above and beyond it in terms of, Hene risking her own life to take water to gravely wounded British officers and that kind of thing.
Were there losses on both sides?
Yeah, so the Māori losses were it's estimated to be between 19 and 32 killed, so a relatively high number. A lot of them killed in the bombardment throughout the day, because although the pā was incredibly well designed, it was an overwhelming bombardment that they faced at the same time.
And why do you think Māori decided to abandon the pā?
The pā had really served its purpose after they had inflicted a crushing defeat on the British forces, and so it had no further purpose for them really after that.
There's not a lot of stories about women in war, but Hene Te Karamu always reappears. What do you know about her?
Well, she had previously fought in the Waikato War. She was at Paparata when it was attacked by the Forest Rangers in December 1863. It was said that she had followed her brother to Pukehinahina, and that arrived the day before, on the 28th of April, with a Ngāti Kuhariki force, and they had occupied the smaller fortification there. And although women had helped to construct Gate Pā, Hori Ngātai said that they were removed to a place of safety before fighting took place. So Hene is the exception to that. She later recalled that she loved her brother so much she wanted to remain by his side, whether they lived or died during the conflict at Pukehinahina.
And what became of Hene?
She lived a very long life. I think she was in her 90s when she died in the 1930s. She later became active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union that fought for the suffrage for women, and was a very active figure within that. And she was also somebody who was often referred to for her recollections around the war. So people like James Cowan and others spoke to her around this. And one of the things that was often debated afterwards was who had taken water to Booth and the others, because there's a famous marble frieze of this at the Mission Cemetery that depicts a man doing that, taking water in a calabash. Well, Hene Te Karamu, when she was asked about this, said that was wrong on two counts. Firstly, it was an iron tin, and secondly, it was her. It wasn't any other man, so she was responsible for this.
When she was asked about the depiction, what did she say?
Well, she said that the description was wrong on two counts. Firstly, it wasn't a calabash of water, it was an iron tin, and secondly, she was the one who had taken it to Booth.
Kapo. Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron, tell us about him. Describe him for us.
Well, Cameron had arrived in the country in 1861 and was overall commander of British forces in New Zealand, led the troops through the invasion of Waikato, and after the Battle of Ōrākau, ends on the 2nd of April 1864, he saw an opportunity for a decisive victory at Tauranga. So when reinforcements are requested for there, he decides to personally lead them and to lead the attack on Gate Pā.
Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron, tell us about him.
So Cameron was a veteran of the Crimean War. He came to New Zealand in 1861, overall commander of British forces in the country, led the troops through the invasion of Waikato in 1863-64, and after the Ōrākau battle ends on the 2nd of April, there are calls, especially from colonial ministers, for that campaign to continue, to press deep into the King Country or into eastern Waikato or into the King Country. He resists those. He feels that he's achieved his objectives in Waikato, but he sees an opportunity at Tauranga. So when further troops are requested for there, he decides to personally lead that contingent. And he, after the crushing defeat at Gate Pa, he talks about he doesn't know what to make of it. He can't make sense of it all. He leaves the district quite soon afterwards, resisting the calls for, to obtain revenge for the fallen British troops who had died there. And he becomes increasingly disillusioned with the war in New Zealand. He begins to see it as something that's been fought for the exclusive benefit of settlers in New Zealand. And at the same time, a lot of the British troops are starting to ask themselves, why should we fight and die for the benefit of settlers in New Zealand? And so there's this growing disillusionment in the ranks. Cameron is a Scotsman. A lot of his soldiers are Irish, and they do. Many of them do become disillusioned. Cameron himself, by 1865, basically refuses to fight any further, and he leaves the country in disgust in the middle of 1865, and doesn't look back fondly on what had unfolded over the last few years. I think in some ways he feels that his troops and men had been used, and many had fought and died for really an unholy war.
And what of Governor George Grey at this stage?
George Grey's role in the Tauranga campaign is sort of quite a complex one, in the sense that here he's not the main cheerleader for invasion. In fact, colonial ministers are the ones who are really pushing for it. In some ways, he's pushing back against them. So when troops first arrive in the district, there are orders issued for them to seize all the crops and cattle of Māori on the western side of the harbour, because they're assumed to be the ones who are overwhelmingly kingitanga supporters. Grey pushes back on that. He has those orders withdrawn, and there's growing conflict and tension with ministers around what should happen at Tauranga, not just in terms of the military campaign, but also the fate of the lands in the district, confiscation. And Cameron, or Grey rather, attends a hui in August 1864, when he says that because of the chivalrous way in which Māori had conducted the war, he proposed to confiscate no more than a quarter of their lands. And there's some confusion about what that means. A lot of Māori understand that as a quarter of the lands belonging to those who'd fought against the Crown, not a quarter of the entire district, for example. There's also this thing that a lot of officials do in the 19th century, which is that they assume that the local Māori are all Ngāi Te Rangi, so they refer to them as the lands of Ngāi Te Rangi. So does that mean the lands of Ngāti Ranganui, for example, are they exempt from confiscation? And so these issues take some years to resolve themselves, and that becomes quite a complex story.
We're moving to Te Ranga now. Why was the site chosen for that pa?
Well, the Rawiri Puhiraki wasn't really happy with the site, and Hori Ngātai later recalled that many of those who constructed or began constructing the pa were in low spirits because they weren't exactly that happy about the site. It didn't have a secure line of escape, which is always one of the most important things in selecting the site for a pa. But they had been prevailed upon by others to take a stand there.
What was the Māori plan there?
So what Rawiri Puhiraki was attempting to do was to draw the British out of their base at Te Papa, because the British had commandeered the mission station there. That was their headquarters, and he was hoping to engage them in conflict at that site. The problem was the point at which, by this stage, Colonel Greer attacked the site. The pa was still very far from completion, so it was an incomplete site that was still in construction.
What was the expectation of reinforcement from other iwi?
Well, throughout the early months of 1864, there had been toa from the east coast attempting to make their way to Tauranga, and up until April 1864 anyway, ultimately to Waikato. And so there was an expectation that they would receive assistance. And actually the makeup of the Māori fighting force at Te Ranga was considerably more diverse than at Pukehinahina. So apart from the local iwi, you also had members of a number of different te arawa hapu, particularly Ngāti Pikia, Ngāti Makino, Ngāti Rangiwewehi. You had some Ngāti Porou, some Tuhui, and various others as well, along with Tauranga iwi. And you also had a much larger force there, so I think you had about 600 people in all at that site.
What was the size and capacity of the British force led by Colonel Greer?
So Greer had 530 men with him on the day, and it's often said that they were out on patrol, but that's a huge number of troops to take out on an ordinary patrol, and there are other suggestions that they may have received intelligence that a pa was in the course of being constructed. And by this point, the British knew that if you came across a pa in construction, you needed to attack as soon as possible before the site was secured, because it was much more difficult to do so once it had been completed. So I think Greer determined to launch an assault as quickly as possible. He called back to Te Papa for reinforcements, so further artillery and men come up. He commences firing on the pa. Once those reinforcements have arrived, they assault the lines, and at this point, really all that had been constructed were rifle pits, basically. That was all that the defenders of Te Ranga had. And this is quite brutal hand-to-hand combat that takes place, really, at Te Ranga. And as I said before, one of the issues with the selection of the site is that there wasn't a secure line of escape, and there are large numbers of Māori killed, not just in the hand-to-hand fighting, but also attempting to retreat from the site afterwards.
I'm just going to bring you back to the other side, like when they arrived, what was happening and how many Māori were there, and what was it, families or men? So you've got the 530 or so troops, and who did they meet when they arrived?
So when they arrive at Te Ranga, there's a force of around 600 Māori there from quite a diverse range of iwi, and they're busy constructing, at this point, basically rifle pits, so they're far from having a completed pa to defend.
Yep. Light aircraft.
I don't think there are any women at Te Ranga. I'm not sure on that, but I think it's the same. I think it's men again.
The understanding from the other interviews is that the men were there preparing, and women might have been carting away things and feeding them and nursing babies and stuff because it hadn't started.
Possibly, I don't know about that though. So
that's the kind of sense we get from the interviews, and then when it comes, they're like trying to get them. Yeah. There's a fighting line, and then everyone else is trying to get out.
That would make sense.
Also, there were some hovering Māori potential reinforcements too that could easily have joined the line.
Yeah.
And didn't, because Greer attacked earlier. Okay.
If who was at Te Ranga, what did they have in terms of fighting gear, and what were they up against?
So there were 600 people at Te Ranga, and they, once again, they didn't have artillery of their own. They didn't have the heavy guns or technological advantages that the British had. And they're just in the process of constructing rifle pits. That's all they have. They don't have a fully constructed or formed pa from which to defend themselves.
And what did the British have? Sorry, just if you could kind of talk about what they came with. They'd walked from town.
Yeah, so Greer brings up 530 men with him. I think they have a 6-pounder Armstrong gun with them that they haul into location, and they yeah, what else? There may have been some other guns hauled up. I don't remember the details.
But mostly would they have a bayonet or something like that?
Oh yes, yeah. So the fighting that takes place at Te Ranga is quite brutal hand-to-hand combat. Māori defenders standing up in their rifle pits, being attacked by British troops, many of them using their bayonets, and there are a huge number of casualties, as there are as Māori seek to retreat from the site. Overall, it's estimated that somewhere between 68 and 123 Māori are killed in the Te Ranga battle. So one of the heaviest losses of the entire New Zealand wars.
And I guess, was there anything recorded about the stories of what happened, how they felt about that attack and what happened afterwards for Māori?
Well, I think Te Ranga is and the losses there are felt deeply, and by many different hapu and iwi as well, because there's very diverse representation at Te Ranga in terms of who's there inside the pa as well. So that is those events are remembered widely.
Would the troops there have wanted to avenge what happened at Pukehinahina? You talk about it being brutal. Was there be a sense of utu there?
Yeah, so the 43rd Regiment fights in both conflicts, and at Pukehinahina they're accused of cowardice, which I think they feel deeply, as they do the loss of their officers and men. So a lot of those troops are out for blood, basically. By the time of Te Ranga, they want revenge.
And they found it. And who died on the battlefield at Te Ranga?
So at Te Ranga, among the many losses, Rawiri Puhiraki is killed, and it's said that when he fell, that caused confusion amongst the defenders of Te Ranga as well. Not unlike the loss of officers for the British at Gate Pa, there's confusion afterwards. They've lost their leader. So that has significant ramifications. Hinare Taratoa is also killed at Te Ranga. He's found with a copy of the Code of Conduct on his body, along with a quote from the Bible: "If thy enemy hunger, feed him; if he thirst, give him drink." So those are two of the notable losses at Te Ranga amongst many.
Those that we've interviewed from Ngāti Ranginui and Perirako talk about the last stand of these two rangatira and how they were going to go down. What kind of, do you know much about Hinare Taratoa and Rawiri Puhiraki? What might they have been going through their minds?
Well, so Puhiraki was someone who had been deeply reluctant to become involved in the war. So after the invasion of Waikato in July 1863, there are calls for assistance from the Tauranga Moana iwi, and he resists that. And it's only when troops arrive at Tauranga in January 1864 that he decides to take a stand and really leads the resistance and defence against that. Hinare Taratoa had trained at St John's Theological College in Auckland, and really the logical next step was for him to go on and become an ordained priest. But it was said that he had a somewhat fiery temperament, and he wasn't considered the right sort of character to take that ultimate step to become an Anglican priest. And he was away at the Otaki mission station with Octavius Hadfield when he heard that conflict had broken out at Tauranga, and rushed home to stand with his people.
Following the fall at Te Ranga, British and colonial forces pit Māori against Māori Te Arawa Flying Squad. Describe the campaign, they call it Te Ranga, or the Bush Wars, and why it was so destructful and painful.
Well, Tauranga Bush campaign lasts from January to March 1867, and it's really a scorched earth campaign led by military settlers and their Māori allies. And the ultimate cause of this conflict is raupatu, it's the confiscation. So George Grey in 1864 had promised Tauranga Māori that only a quarter of their lands would be confiscated, but in reality, confiscation becomes much broader than that. So you have in May 1865, a 290,000 acre area is confiscated under the New Zealand Settlements Act, all the way from Katikati north down to further east of Tauranga Harbour. And the confiscation block within that is supposed to be 50,000 acres, and it's supposed to be confined within the Waimapu and Wairoa streams, but the British decide that there are better lands beyond that. So they start encroaching beyond that agreed boundary of that area. They also conduct what is known as the Katikati Tupuna purchase, which is not a land purchase in the ordinary sense. In fact, one colonial minister at the time, William Fox, described it as a forced acquisition under colour of a voluntary sale. So basically, Tauranga Māori weren't given the option to sell or not to sell. They were told, this is what's going to happen. We're taking this land, here's some money for it. So that adds another 93,000 acres to that confiscation, so you're up to nearly half the district by then. Then you've got this long, convoluted process to return the remaining lands, but that only goes to Māori who were deemed to have surrendered to the Crown. So unsurrendered rebels are not eligible for that. Many of those groups from Ngāti Ranganui in particular, Pirirako and other hapu, resist, and they're denied any lands at all, so they're rendered landless. And many of these issues come to the forefront during that Bush campaign in 1867, which begins when Māori who had not surrendered to the Crown begin actively disrupting and protesting surveys of the confiscated lands, which they feel encroach on areas that were not supposed to be part of the area that was taken by the Crown. And it's a campaign led by colonial militia and their Māori allies, the Arawa Flying Column, and they engage in scorched earth tactics, basically destroying a series of kainga villages in the interior, destroying their crops, destroying their homes, and many of those settlements belong to hapu who had never surrendered, they'd never made their submission to the Crown. They resisted confiscation, they were actively resisting the survey of those confiscated lands. And this expedition is sent in really as a punitive one, and causes enormous suffering for those communities who see their homes and their crops destroyed.
Were there deaths?
One of the things about the Tauranga Bush campaign is that it's not very well documented. So a lot of the stories around this history are probably ones that are held by the tribal custodians of that knowledge. There aren't a lot of detailed reports about what takes place on the ground. We know the broad parameters of it. In terms of overall number of casualties and so on, that's a lot murkier.
Why were the Bush Wars not recorded in history?
So in 1866, the British began progressively withdrawing their troops from New Zealand, and after that, colonial troops and their Māori allies were solely responsible for fighting the wars on behalf of the Crown. So British troops no longer had any role in that. And in some ways, one of the consequences of that is the wars take on a harsher, more racially tinged sort of aspect to them as well.
And just because of I don't know when that
the banging
reverse happened, but the numbers regarding acreages taken that you mentioned, and extending beyond the river boundary, so that was half. If you could go through a bit of those.
Yeah, I'll just ask you that again. What was the extent of confiscations?
So in August 1864, Governor Grey had promised that no more than a quarter of the lands of local Māori would be confiscated. But in May 1865, an area of 290,000 acres is proclaimed as confiscated under the New Zealand Settlements Act. all the lands from north of Katikati, extending east to well beyond the Tauranga harbour. And within that, what's known as the military settlements block, an area that's supposed to be 50,000 acres to be retained by the Crown, is identified. And that's supposed to be located between the Wairoa and Waimapu streams. But the Crown decides to extend confiscation beyond that to select better lands elsewhere. They also engage in something called the Katikati Tupuna purchase, which covers an area of about 93,000 acres. And although that's described as a purchase of land, it's really one in which local Māori are given no option to retain those lands. They're told the Crown is taking this land, here's some money for it. So you combine those two areas, that's nearly half the 290,000 acres that are taken. Then you've got this convoluted process to return the remaining lands, except Māori who have not surrendered to the Crown are deemed ineligible to receive any of those lands. And so a number of the Hapuan communities who were attacked during the Tauranga Bush campaign in 1867 are these people known as unsurrendered rebels who are being punished for their resistance to confiscation in the district.
And what of those who were soldiers fighting for the Crown? What were they given?
Well, a number of the soldiers fighting at this point were essentially military settlers, so they're being given a slice of the confiscated lands in return for their service.
We think about the treaty settlements process and Tauranga Moana iwi mostly unsettled. What do you make of, how those iwi, particularly Pirirako and Ngāti Ranginui, Ngai Tamarawaho, feel today?
The legacies of these conflicts are ones that continue to be felt and experienced in lots of ways, including the fact that large numbers of Māori are rendered landless, and that has intergenerational consequences. So there's an official return done in 1900 of Māori rendered landless as a result of confiscation, and there would be hundreds of Māori from Tauranga on that list, and each one of those people represents a whānau probably, and so that would represent a very large proportion of the local Māori population who are rendered landless as a result of raupatu in this district.
What are the takeaways for all New Zealanders from this campaign?
Well, I think that this is a hugely significant series of conflicts in the area that shaped Tauranga Moana, and it's evident today in all kinds of ways, including, if you go to the site at Pukehinehina, one of the things that the British did was demolish the park, run a road through the middle of it, and name it Cameron Road after the commander of British forces who led the invasion of the district. And there are lots of other examples of that locally. One of the major suburbs here, Greerton, named after Greer, who was one of the senior officers in the district, also involved in those campaigns. So there are lots of, daily reminders of this history in the district. But I think for a long time, local Pākehā haven't really been willing to engage with that history. I think it's starting to shift a bit now, and there are some positive developments, such as the planned new museum in the district, and indeed the New Zealand Wars Heritage Centre to be constructed on or near the site of Pukehinehina as well. So I think those are really positive developments in terms of the way we engage with and reflect on this history.